Well, I want to start this morning with a simple question that has big implications. And so the question is this: is God the most important thing in your life? Is God the most important thing in your life? Think about that for a moment. Like, how radical are you willing to get to follow Jesus? Would you change your job to follow Jesus? Would you change your career path? Would you adjust some major thing in your life? Would you, forego watching the Super Bowl today to follow Jesus? Some of you are like, whoa. I thought we were friends, Travis. What gives? Right? I'm just picking on you. Like, how far really, though, are we willing to go to follow Jesus? Is God the most important thing in your life, or is God just part of your life? And the reason for this question is because there's kind of another follow-up question that this question would imply. And that question is our life available for God to use? Is our life available for God to use? And so these two questions kind of fit together. And this question, is our heart available? Is our life available for God to use? It's at the heart of our life being filled with purpose and calling. Can God interrupt our plans? Now, I don't know about you, but for me, I do not do well with interrupted plans. Like, how many of you are with me? Like you don't like it when your plans get interrupted. Yeah, I really don't like my plans getting interrupted. This last week, my plans got interrupted a little bit. Like the flu, the plague hit the Conklin household. And if you've experienced that, if you have a baby or children and all of a sudden your children are sick and puking all over the place, that's an interruption. It's not a fun interruption, right? And so I had the night before, Jennica and I were talking, we're okay, so Judah's really sick, and who's going to take the night shift? Okay, you're going to take the night shift. I'll take the midnight shift to 1 o'clock, and then you'll, right? And so we're divvying out our responsibilities. And so I had the 1 o'clock shift. She had the midnight or 1 o'clock on shift. And then I got up in the morning, though, and we had just spent the whole night just getting puked on, every 15 minutes, right? And it's just been, glorious. I'm so glad we had a baby. And it's just, one of those precious moments, right? And, and so in the morning, it's my turn again. And so I've got Judah, and he is just spent, right? He's just been miserable all night long, and the cute little guy is just worn out, and he's a little fussy, and he's just tired, and so I'm sitting there, and he just kind of crawls up on my lap, and I'm holding him, and I'm covered in puke residue, right? You kind of cleaned it up, but you're not sure how much you got. And so we're sitting there, and Judah's laying on my chest, and he just kind of closes his eyes and just lays there. And I just realized in that moment how precious this actually was. It's moments like those where we realize I got to be intimate with my son, and we battled all night long, right? It had been a battle all night long. But it ended with this kind of precious, intimate moment with me kind of holding him. And listen, I'll do anything for Judah Snuggles. So, it was worth every bit of the puking. And then about an hour later, he was a grouchy, fussy mess. Anyways, so, right? But, in that moment, it was wonderful. And here's the deal. It's in opportunities where God interrupts our life that we learn and we grow, and we have an opportunity to step into deeper intimacy with him. It's often in those moments where we've been battling through something, and we get to the finish line of whatever it was we were battling through, that we tend to draw close. It's an invitation from the Lord. And so this morning, we're going to take a look at a passage from Exodus 4, verse 1, and we're going to see how God uses simple, ordinary things to accomplish the extraordinary in our life. And so if you have a Bible, you can turn with me to Exodus 4, verse 1, and we'll get there in just a second. I want to give you a little bit of a background here. So this passage is talking about a man named Moses, and Moses was born an Israelite because of the Egyptian laws to control the Jewish population, all firstborn sons were to be killed. Okay, so this was like a law. And so if you had a baby and you were going to have a son and it was your first, like you just knew like this is not going to go well. And so Moses was hid by his parents for about 3 months, and then there was this point where they kind of like released the son down the Nile River, and there's a whole lot that kind of went into that process, but what they were doing was trying to get Moses to safety, and they're trying to get Moses to a place where somebody would recognize this baby and would maybe take him in and care for him. And that's exactly what happened. And so God used that moment to orchestrate his incredible plan. And so as Moses is floating down the river, the daughter of Pharaoh sees this baby and takes the baby in. And it's through this process that now Moses begins the trajectory of a completely different life. And so it was said of Moses, and I think there was even a meme created saying something like this, that Moses spent the first part of his life thinking he was a somebody because he grew up in Pharaoh's palace, right? He had privilege at his fingertips. Then the middle part of his life thinking he was a nobody because he became a fugitive. And you can read the whole story. We don't have time to go into all the details this morning, but he became a fugitive and he ended up running from Egypt and hiding in the mountains, where he ends up working for this man as a shepherd. And so he lives this simple life. Then the last part of his life, Moses spent learning what God can do with a nobody. And that's what we're going to talk about today. You see, God has this incredible track record of taking ordinary people like you and I and doing extraordinary things in and through our lives. That's what he did with Moses. With God, it doesn't matter if you're wealthy or if you're poor. It doesn't matter if you are young or if you're seasoned. It doesn't matter what color skin you have. Like, it doesn't matter your background. It doesn't matter your past. God looks at you and says, I want to do something great in and through that person's life. I want to do something great through you. Is God the most important thing in our life? So, Exodus 4, verse 1. Moses, he's having this conversation with God. And God's asked him to go to Pharaoh and request the release of the Israelites from slavery. That's a big ask. And it says this in verse 1. But Moses protested again. What if they won't believe me or listen to me? What if they say, well, the Lord never appeared to you? Then the Lord asked him, and I want you to pay attention to this. What is in your hand? Moses, what is in your hand? A shepherd's staff, Moses replied. Throw it on the ground, the Lord told him. So Moses threw the staff down on the ground, and it turned into a snake. Moses jumped back. Then the Lord told him, reach out and grab its tail. So Moses reached out and grabbed it, and it turned back into a shepherd's staff in his hand. Perform this sign, the Lord told him. Then they will believe that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, really has appeared to you. Then the Lord said to Moses, now put your hand inside of your cloak. So Moses puts his hand inside of his cloak, and when he took it out again, his hand was white as snow with a severe skin disease. Now put your hand back into your cloak, the Lord said. So Moses put his hand back in, and when he took it out again, it was as healthy as the rest of his body. Verse 8, the Lord said to Moses, if they do not believe you and are not convinced by the first miraculous sign, they'll be convinced by the second sign. And if they don't believe you or listen to you after these two signs, then take some water from the Nile River and pour it out on the ground, on the dry ground. When you do, the water from the Nile will turn to blood on the ground. But listen, because this is the part that gets really relatable, I think. Verse 10, but Moses pleaded with the Lord, oh Lord, I'm not very good with words, and I never have been, and I'm not now. Even though you have spoken to me, I get tongue-tied and my words get tangled. Do you ever complain to God? Like, God, you don't understand how hard my life is. Right? Anybody ever do that? This picture cracks me up because this is kind of like what I picture, like us complaining to God looks like, right? Mel Gibson talking to Jesus, or what is his name, Jim over there, right? So we do this. And this is kind of like a relatable part of his story where he's just like, God, I'm not good enough. I never have been very good with my words, and I don't know. And then the Lord asks Moses, I love this, who makes a person's mouth? Who decides whether people speak or do not speak? Hear or do not hear? See or do not see? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will be with you as you speak, and I will instruct you in what to say. And then Moses starts back up. But Moses again pleaded, Lord, please send anyone else. But what follows is Moses goes to Pharaoh, and there's a lot of twists and turns in the story, but he begins to, this process of obediently doing what God's asking him to do. And in the end, God uses Moses through Pharaoh and through all this stuff to release the Israelites from captivity. And that's kind of the end of the story. But I think there's a lot about Moses' journey that I relate to. I see these kind of things in my life. Like, anybody ever felt like, Lord, here I am, send anybody else, right? Like, we want God to use us, but only when it's convenient. And I think that's kind of where Moses is at. Like, Lord, I'm willing to let you use me, but God, can you have me not do that thing? That's really hard. Or what about his argument with God? God, I'm not very good at, for Moses, it was speaking. What is it for us? God, I'm not very good at this thing that you've invited me to do. God, I'm not very good. I don't think I could do that thing you've asked me to do. That sounds difficult. I don't have the skills to do that. But God says to Moses, Moses, who made your mouth? It's hard to argue with that one, isn't it? You know, a number of years ago, my daughter Ellie, I have a picture. It was she was about 3 years old at the time. See, she's so cute. And she, you know, she had like this great approach to life. Like, she was just like sassy as ever, right? Like, that was her demeanor all the time. And there's this moment where I needed her to help clean up the toys, right? You know, the song, like, clean up, right? So we're doing that thing, and I'm like, honey, I need you to come over here. Can you help me clean up your toys? And she goes, I can't. I can't. And I was like, oh, honey, why not? And she goes, because I don't want to, and I'm very messy. Right? So, like, her answer to this, come clean toys, was, I can't, I'm messy. I don't want to, right? Like, and this is her approach. Don't we sometimes do that with the Lord? We make excuses to delay taking action, where the Lord will invite us to do something, and we say, I can't. I'm pretty messy. My life is not where it should be, and I don't know that I can do the things that I need to do, and so I can't, God. I'm the wrong guy. You must have got that wrong. You picked the wrong guy. And so we make these excuses, and it really is just us delaying us having to step out and take action on some of the things that we know that God has invited us into. And some of those things are challenging, for sure. Some of those things are beyond anything we ever could do on our own. But even in spite of our excuses, God is so gracious with us, isn't he? The same way he was gracious with Moses. You see, there's some really interesting things happening here, even in some of the ways that God shows up in this moment. Such as the 3 signs that God used to speak to Moses and to speak to Pharaoh. The 3 signs, the snake, the hand, and the water from the Nile. At the time, the snake would have represented something really powerful, and it would have actually had a very important meaning, both to Moses and to Pharaoh. Because the snake to Pharaoh was a symbol of a false god called Wadjet, if I'm pronouncing that right. And this was an early false god who was said to control and protect the land, and specifically was tasked with the role to protect Pharaoh, the king. And at the time, this would have meant something significant because God used a snake and showed that he had power over this snake. And this imagery, it came to symbolize Pharaoh's sovereignty, his royalty, his deity, and his divine authority in ancient Egypt. In fact, the snake was used in the king's headdress, as part of his headdress. There was like imagery built into the headdress. And so God showed that I have authority over the snake. But then he took it farther and he showed that I have authority over the human body. And then he took it even farther and showed that God has control over nature itself. And he has more power than any false god that could have ever been worshipped in that day, and more power than Pharaoh. And by the way, Pharaoh would have viewed himself as a god. And God was like, no, I have even more power than you think you have, Pharaoh. And over the course of this story, you even see later on in the moment when the 10 plagues over Egypt, God uses even those plagues to speak some of the same kind of stuff, where he systematically tears down all of these false gods over Egypt, and he shows, I'm better than that one, 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 to eventually the god that was considered to be the most powerful in Egypt by the Egyptians was the god of the sun. That was a god, small case G, god that they worshiped, and God was like, oh yeah? I'm going to just like turn the sun off for a little while. What was he doing? He was saying, listen, Moses, I'm in control, man. I'm with you, and I can do anything I need to move about any motion that needs to happen. Trust me. And then he used that to speak to Pharaoh and say, I am more powerful than you or any other false god you can put before me. And that would have been a really powerful thing. Here's the deal. God's invitation to use our life, it's not given because we're ready or somehow great at what he's invited us into. Instead, God gets us ready as we take a step of faith into his plan, just as Moses did. You see, some of us want to experience the things of God in our life. We want, like we hear the stories and we get excited about God moving, and we want those sort of things in our life. But it goes back to the question, is God the most important thing in our life? Does God have access to those parts of our life? Is God the most important thing in our life? You see, we give Moses a hard time for arguing with God, but in the end, Moses stood before Pharaoh, and he did what God had asked of him. And it was bumpy along the way. He didn't get it right 100% of the time, but he was obedient. And by the way, this could have cost Moses his life, going to Pharaoh. But in the end, God moved, and Israel was freed from slavery. That's what God can do with a nobody that says yes to God. So I want to spend the remainder part of our time today talking about some of the ways that we can say yes to God. When God gives us an invitation, we can begin the process of saying yes to him. And so the first is this: give God whatever you have in your hand. Give God what's in your hand. I love this question in verse 2. Then the Lord asked him, what is in your hand? And it was a staff, right? Then God proceeds to use the staff that he had to perform a miracle. The second part of this is even better to me, and I don't know if you caught this, but as if God was like anticipating his arguments. Like Moses was like arguing with God. God, well, what about this? Well, what? And God was like, okay, I'm just going to step ahead of the game here, get ahead of your argument. And so he says, and Moses, if that doesn't work, I'm going to use more than what's in your hand. I'm going to use your hand. Put your hand in your cloak, right? And God actually uses his hand. Forget the stick. God has him put his hand in his cloak for the second miracle. You see, God can use whatever we have to accomplish his purposes. He doesn't need us to all be pastors and worship leaders. What a boring world this would be. But God uses ordinary people like you and I to accomplish the extraordinary. But it's when we give him everything we have that things really start to move. When we say, God, I'm going to give you access to every part of my life, even the scary, hard parts of my life. I'm not going to give you just access to the easy areas. I'm going to give you entire, full access to everything I am, everything I have, and everything I want to be. Would you use my life for your glory? So here's a question. What is in your hand? What do you have that God could invite you to use for his glory? Travis, I don't know that I have much to offer God. I don't know. Great. Then offer him that. See, that's the beautiful thing about this. We don't have to have much, but we have our lives. And we can offer our lives to God and say, God, would you just use the ordinary, simple things in my life for your glory? And he will. Gideon, Ruth, Moses, Mary, David. These are just a few examples of God doing this in the Bible. You know, I knew a man, his name was Barry Webb, and he's passed on now, but when he was alive, he never became a pastor, he never became a missionary, he never, probably by world standards, would have never really done anything that we would have considered super remarkable. But he was a carpenter, and he was a family man. And this carpenter and family man, he had this little carpentry shop, and he would take high school students and college students, and periodically over the course of the years that he was a carpenter, he would hire them to come and work for him. And what he would do is when they would work for him, he would just spend time intentionally instilling values into these young men. And he would just teach them some simple things like how to love Jesus, how to work really, really hard, and how to live a life full of purpose and calling. He regularly would say things like, you know, it's not all about working hard. We need to make sure that we honor Jesus as well. We need to make sure we take care of our families. He was an ordinary man. He lived a really simple life, but out of about 10 of the men that I knew of that had worked for him, out of the 10, 2 of them became pretty accomplished worship leaders. I just thought this was interesting. Almost all of them became fathers themselves. 3 of them became missionaries, and 2 of them became pastors. This is an ordinary guy, of which I am actually one of the 2 pastors. His name was Barry Webb. He was a carpenter. I worked for him in high school. But there are still things in my life today that I can attribute to having been deposited by this man. So don't ever underestimate what God can do with the simple, ordinary things in our life. When we give God access to our entire life, he will use our entire life to bring about incredible things. And we may not see all of them in our lifetime, but we can trust that he will use everything we give him access to. So what's in your hand? What's in your hand? Second way that we can say yes to God is to trust God to multiply whatever we give him. To trust God to multiply whatever we give him. Matthew 14, verse 15, there's this passage where Jesus is teaching a very large group of people. And it starts getting late, and so the disciples tell Jesus, hey, send these people home so they can go home and get some food. And so that's kind of what's happening. And Jesus responds to them. And so if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn with me to Matthew 14, verse 15. And actually, we'll go ahead and jump down to verse 16. This is Jesus' response. But Jesus said, that isn't necessary. You feed them. But we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. We're really good at excuses, aren't we? Right? Verse 18, bring them here, he said. Then he told the people to sit down on the grass. Jesus took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, looked up towards heaven and blessed them. Then breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted. And afterwards, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. You know, if you do the math on this, it's estimated that crowd was somewhere between maybe 15 and 25,000 people. 5 loaves and 2 fish. You see, God isn't limited by what we see, what we have, or what we don't have. God can do extraordinary things through simple obedience. Through simple obedience. Where we obediently take the steps that God has put in front of us. Where he invites us to take another step. And then he multiplies our actions to bring about something remarkable. In Moses' case, it was standing before Pharaoh. In the disciples' case, it was passing out some bread and fish. In Barry's case, it was living his life and just being intentional with a few young men. You know, one of the ways that this has happened in the life of this church is actually this building that we're in right now. You may or may not know this story, but when we first started looking for this building, it started actually way before we really had any chance of getting into this building. And so we had outgrown our other building over by the old bag factory, and we were hitting this point where we were like, well, we really need a building. We need to figure this next step out. And so we just were looking. And I had our board of directors at the times looking with me, and we're looking, and we weren't finding anything. We kept finding buildings that weren't good for what we needed it for, or they were too small, or they were way too big. There was all these different things that were playing out, and just wasn't finding what we needed. And so finally, we just started praying. We just asked the Lord, what do we do next? And we felt like the Lord gave us kind of 2 steps. The first step was we needed to actually include a broader group of leaders in the conversation. So that was the first step. So we did. We communicated to a broader group of leaders that, hey, this is what we're doing. And the church knew that we were kind of moving in that direction, but we brought them in and said, hey, we need you to help us search. The second thing he asked us to do was start raising funds so that we could move, which felt a little silly at the time because we didn't have a building in mind. We just knew at some point we might do this. So we took those 2 steps. We put it out there to our leaders. We started raising funds. And as this starts happening, it wasn't long, we have one of our leaders came to me and said, hey, so you know the Mega Plaza? This was the Mega Plaza at the time. I think the church that owns it is about ready to sell it. You guys interested? Yeah. So here's a backstory. When we first planted this church in Goshen, Jennica and I would drive by this building and say, man, wouldn't it be cool if someday that was our building? I'm not making that up. But then, when we were looking for our first building that we purchased, I actually approached them about buying this building, and they said, oh, no, we're not interested in selling. It's not even an option. Right? So, like, the doors had been shut for all this time. But we were sensing something in our hearts. And so when he said Mega Plaza, Jennica and I were like, no way. Right? This is a big moment. And so we're like, well, I don't even know if we could possibly afford it. That's got to be a really expensive building. But it was a church that was selling it, and they said, hey, listen, because you guys are a church, we're going to, 1, give you first dibs on the building, and 2, we're actually going to give it to you for under market value. And so we purchased this building way under market value. We got it before anybody had the chance to buy it. And here's the deal. Like when Planet Fitness found out that we'd bought it, they're like, hey, we would have bought it. Because they're renting from us. So like God worked out all of these things that we never in a million years could have afforded or figured out ourselves. Simple act of obedience taking the step that God's put in front of you, God can multiply it. And now, isn't it cool that we get to celebrate in this space what God has done? It's amazing. Those are the things that God will do with our lives when we just step out and do what he's inviting us to do. Simple act of obedience. Because obedience implies trust. In this case, trust in God. And trust implies faith. And the Bible teaches us that faith is very pleasing to the Lord. Obedience comes through faith, and faith multiplies our actions. So in closing, I'm going to have our worship team come back up. What has God put in your hand right now? Do you have a skill or a little extra time or maybe some resources that God's inviting you to lay before him so that he can use? Or maybe you don't feel like you have much to offer at all. And God's like, that's okay. I can use that too. Does God have access to that space in your life, no matter how great or small it feels like it is? And then what would happen if we would start to give God access to everything we have, and we would begin to submit to him what little we have and watch him multiply it? What would that look like? What would it look like for God to multiply in our lives the spiritual things that we prayed? The things that we laid out before him and we said, God, I want you to give you access in this part of my life. God, I'm struggling in this area, but I want to give you access to this part of my life. What would it look like for God to multiply in that area? Would it help us overcome addictions? Probably. Would it help us move forward in some places we haven't moved forward before? Probably. But what else could God multiply in our lives? It's likely that us stepping out and doing this, it often looks like a simple act of obedience. And I want to be clear, obedience isn't about trying to earn God's grace. That's freely given. Obedience is about learning to trust that God's invitation is always an invitation into something greater than we could ever accomplish on our own. That's what obedience is about. Us stepping into something God is inviting us into.